Hello and welcome to another update. In this one, I'll be covering the latest updates from the Ukrainian offensive. So starting out in the Backwood region, it has been relatively silent here as there is no territorial advances or changes on this part of the front line. There has been a few videos coming out of fighting actually happening, so we know fighting is happening. However, it has essentially reached a stalemate. The main push from the Ukrainians were here south of Berhivka. However, after capturing the river line here by the reservoir, they have not been able to advance further, and that is most likely because the Russians are heavily shelling and attacking all of the Ukrainian forces passing this area, and it is difficult for the Ukrainians to actually hold the places across because they have the river line to their back, which will it difficult for the Ukrainian forces to advance rapidly across it, which allows the Russians to outnumber the Ukrainian forces passing through it, as it is a lengthy process. So there's mainly artillery fighting duels happening here, but the Ukrainian forces continue pressing onwards, trying to capture the village, and that is because if the Ukrainians manage to capture Berhivka, then essentially Dubovo-Vasilivka would be cut off, and that would allow the Ukrainians to form a encirclement of Dubovo-Vasilivka, advance through the E40 highway, advance northwards, cutting off Selzniansky, and then start pressuring the river line here to the north of Bakhmut, as well as the villages of Pereskovivka and Blagodatne. So the Ukrainians are heavily focusing their attacks on Berhivka, and the Russians are forced to hold it at all costs, because if they do not hold it, then it will endanger the whole northern flank in the Bakhmut region. As for the southern direction of Klishchiivka, the Ukrainians are also attacking here, however, though it is an open field, which makes it difficult for them to launch any operations here. They would have to rely heavily on armored vehicles, but most of those are reserved for the Zaporizhzhia front, where the main thrust is happening. So here we are seeing the most activity by Velika Novosilka, the south of the village. There's been a lot of reports over the past 24 hours of Makarivka as well as Urushaine, as there's a lot of fighting happening here, and that is mainly because the Ukrainian forces are throwing a lot of forces here at Urushaine, trying to capture the village, as they have the advantage right now, they have the momentum, and the Russian forces started counterattacking in the direction of Makarivka. So something very interesting is that if we take a look at the dates, the 10th and 11th of June, you see that the Ukrainian forces managed to advance on these 2 days. So what is so special about these 2 days? It is that both of these days there were rain going on. And what does rain mean? It means that neither the Russian or Ukrainian drones or Air Force are able to fly properly. So most operations are cancelled in the air, which means that the advantage that the Russians have in the air is completely nullified in the days where there is rain. So in rainy days, days with heavy clouds or stormy days, the Ukrainians will essentially be even when it comes to the front line. So this is why we saw the Ukrainian forces advance on these 2 days, is because the great advantage that the Air Force is giving the Russians had been nullified. If we compare this offensive with the Kharkiv and Kherson offensive, the main difference is that the Russian Air Force is actively supporting the defenses on this part of the front line, as well as the Russians actually defending the front line. Unlike the other offensives where they would always retreat as soon as the Ukrainian forces managed to advance a bit, especially here by the Kharkiv offensive, as soon as the Ukrainian forces managed to capture Balaklia, they then advanced to Wolohiv Yar, the Russian retreated to Shevchenkove, then the Ukrainians advanced to Shevchenkove, where the Russians then retreated to Kupiansk, and then the Ukrainians reached Kupiansk and they retreated across the Oskil River line. The same here by Izium. By the time the Ukrainians had captured Balaklia and Shevchenkove, the Russians were already withdrawing completely from Izium with all of their forces beyond the Oskil River line. So in the Kharkiv front, the Russians just retreated without fighting. They didn't have the forces to hold back the Ukrainian offensive. In the Kherson offensive, we saw that the Russians tried to hold back the Ukrainian forces as long as possible as they were retreating across the river line. So in both of these scenarios, the Russians weren't planning on putting up a fight. They were just trying to retreat as fast as they could without getting noticed. In comparison, here in the Zaporizhzhia front, the Russians seem to hold all of the locations. They're trying to hold the point of contact, and they have the first defensive line as well as multiple defensive lines beyond that to completely hold back any Ukrainian advance. And at the same time, we're seeing extensive use of the Russian Air Force, which was essentially mostly non-existent in these parts. At the very most, it was a fraction of what we see nowadays. In almost all of the videos, we are seeing drones, helicopters, and airplanes, fighter jets supporting the Russian defense in these parts of the front line. So this is why we are mainly seeing Ukrainian advances when the weather is bad, and we're seeing Russian forces counterattack as soon as it becomes sunny again. So we have to keep an eye out on the weather if we want to see which side has the advantage. So currently we're seeing the Ukrainian forces attacking on the whole front line. However, it doesn't seem like they are advancing much further than Makarivka, as the Russian forces are counterattacking heavily. They want to hold on to Uroshaine as well as trying to recapture Makarivka. This is very interesting because the Russian forces do have the high ground advantage here. However, them attacking means that they are using and expending their forces that they could use in the defense, instead using it to attack. This must mean one of two things: either that the position is very important, or the Russians see themselves as having an overwhelming advantage in this part. So either the Russians sent reinforcements here, which allowed them to outnumber the Ukrainian forces, or because they are able to use their air force again, they saw the opportunity and wanted to take it. According to pro-Russian sources, Makarivka has been taken by the Russians. However, neither Remy nor Syriac Maps or Deep State Map has updated that, so I'm keeping it as Ukrainian control so far. If any of those sources report on this, then I may change it. But so far, it seems that the front line is stable from yesterday, so there's been no territorial changes. So the current situation is very dynamic, as both sides are sending a lot of reinforcements to these parts of the front line. According to this CNN article, the Ukrainians have lost 16 US-made armored vehicles, the M2 Bradleys, and that is about 15% of what they had received from the United States. So if they have lost 15% on the first week, then that doesn't look too bright for them. However, they do have some advances, and depending on the Russian losses, which are unclear so far, then they could have a better advantage. But as I said, the Russian losses are very unclear. They could be very heavy. It could also be essentially non-existent. Depending on how many casualties they're taking, the Ukrainian forces' offensive could be either a major success or a major blunder. So we'll have to see if the Ukrainians release any footage in the future. So far, they have been very conservative with the footage that they release. They are hardly sending any combat footage. And most footage we're seeing is from the Russian side, seeing a lot of destroyed Ukrainian equipment. So far, it is unclear exactly how successful the Ukrainian offensive is. It seems to me that the first phase was a major defeat for the Ukrainians, as it took a lot of casualties for the probing attacks. However, the second phase is looking a lot better for the Ukrainians, as they have managed to capture these 4 villages and are heavily pressuring the Russian forces in this part of the front line. However, they are yet to reach the first line of defense. So depending on how long it takes for them to reach that first line of defense and how many losses they take in the process, the second phase could either be a major success or a major defeat. We'll have to see in the next coming days to weeks. And that is all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.